Hi, welcome to today's On This Day in Tudor History. I'm Claire Ridgway. I wrote the book On This Day in Tudor History, which has served as inspiration for these daily videos. I bring you births, deaths, marriages, battles, executions, all sorts of things on a daily basis. Today I'm taking you back to 1533, which was of course in the reign of King Henry VIII. For it was on this day in Tudor history, the 25th of June 1533, that the 37-year-old Mary Tudor, and there were two Mary Tudors, but this Mary Tudor was the sister of Henry VIII and wife of his friend Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. She sadly died at her home of Westhorpe Hall in Suffolk. She was survived by her husband, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, who was her second husband, and also survived by their children, Francis, Eleanor, and Henry, although Henry would go on to die sadly in March 1534. Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, remarried just 3 months later, marrying his 14-year-old ward, Catherine Willoughby. Now, it is not known what Mary died of in 1533, because she wasn't that old. Theories include angina, tuberculosis, and cancer. Now, David Loades, in his biography of Mary, writes of how Mary had been taken ill at Woodstock in 1518, so a lot earlier, and attended by royal physicians there. And then in March 1520, the Duke of Suffolk wrote to Cardinal Wolsey apologising for his absence in the King's Council and excusing himself by way of his wife's ill health. He wrote, "Whereas I of a certain space have not given mine attendance upon your lordship in the King's Council, according to my duty, I beseech your lordship to pardon me thereof. The cause why hath been that the said French queen hath had and yet hath diverse physicians with her for her old disease in her side, and as yet cannot be perfectly restored to her health. And albeit I have been 2 times at London, only to have the intent to have waited upon your lordship, yet her grace at either time hath so sent for me that I might not otherwise do but return home again. Nevertheless, her grace is now in such good amendment that upon Tuesday or Wednesday next coming, I intend by God's grace to wait upon your lordship." Now, Mary also mentioned her illness in a letter to her brother the king. Mary had, however, recovered in time to accompany the King and Queen Catherine of Aragon to the Field of Cloth of Gold meeting in June 1520, that historic meeting between Henry VIII and Francis I of France. But then fast forward to 1533 and Mary was taken ill again. It is difficult to know whether it was a new illness or the same illness that had caused her problems back in 1518 and 1520, and that had troubled her previously. In her book, Lives of the Princesses of England, Mary Ann Everett Green writes of how elaborate the funeral honours paid to Mary were. Mary's body was embalmed and then enclosed in a leaden coffin and taken to what Everett Green describes as the beautiful cloistered chapel adjoining the house, where a pall of richly embroidered blue velvet was draped over it and tapers were burned around it for 3 weeks while attendants kept watch over it. A mass was performed each day. On Monday the 20th of July, mourners gathered at the chapel at Westhorpe and a solemn dirge was sung. On Tuesday the 21st of July, Mary's eldest daughter Frances acted as chief mourner and attended mass with members of the family before the funeral. 6 gentlemen carried Mary's coffin from the chapel to a funeral car drawn by 6 horses. This car and horses were all draped with black velvet, and the velvet on the horses was embroidered with the Dowager Queen's arms. A pall of cloth of gold of frieze decorated with a cross and a representation of the Queen wearing her state robes with a crown and sceptre was thrown over the coffin. Now you might think, why with her dressed as queen when she was the king's sister? Well, of course, she had been Queen of France. She had married King Louis XII of France, so she was Dowager Queen of France, and she was actually always known as the French Queen rather than being called the Duchess of Suffolk. 100 poor men in black and carrying a taper each led the procession, followed by the clergy of the chapel, knights, barons and gentlemen, and then officers of the Queen's household, Garter and Clarence Kings at arms, the Queen's chamberlain, all of those people on horseback. Then came the funeral car or funeral cart, which was surrounded by 100 torch-bearing yeomen. Then the Lady Frances, the French Queen's daughter, on horseback with the Marquis of Dorset on her right and Lord Clifford on her left. Behind them came 10 ladies on horseback, each attended by a servant, and they were followed by 2 mourning chariots, the Queen's ladies on foot, and yeomen and servants and anyone else who wanted to pay their respects to Mary. This procession arrived at the Abbey of Bury St Edmunds at 2 p.m. that day, where it was met by the priests of that parish. The coffin was moved to a hearse, which was decorated with black sarcenet, fringed with silk and gold and embroidered with the Queen's arms, her devices and her motto, La volonté de Dieu me suffit. The church's pillars and aisle was draped with black cloth bearing the Queen's arms. After the mourners had entered, a dirge was chanted by the clergy, and the French pursuivant who was in attendance cried out, "Pray for the soul of the right high excellent princess and right Christian Queen, Mary, late French Queen, and all Christian souls." After the ceremony, the mourners enjoyed a supper before mourners were chosen to keep watch around the hearse. 2 masses were celebrated the next morning. Then after breakfast, there was a requiem mass. I love how the bells always ring at the right time. So a requiem mass for the French Queen. Mary Ann Everett Green describes how after the sermon and mass, the Lady Frances and her sister retired, missing the burial, and she believes that they were too overcome with grief to be able to carry on. With them missing, the coffin was lowered into the burial site, and the head officers of the Queen's household broke their staves of office and threw them into the grave, as was traditional. There was then a dinner for everyone, and food, drink and alms were distributed to the poor of Bury St Edmunds. Now, Everett Green also writes of how Mary's brother, King Henry VIII, ordered funeral services to be performed at Westminster and St Paul's in Mary's honour. When the Abbey of Bury St Edmunds was dissolved during the dissolution of the monasteries, Mary's remains, of course, had to be moved, and they were moved to St Mary's Church in Bury St Edmunds, so her remains were not lost during the dissolution. In the 18th century, Mary's resting place was disturbed and locks of her hair were cut off, and preserved in lockets, one of which can be seen in Bury St Edmunds Moyses Hall Museum today. So that's what happened on this day in Tudor history. In the year 1533, we have the death of Mary Tudor, sister of King Henry VIII, the Dowager Queen of France, having been married to King Louis XII, but who at the time of her death was married to Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, who was, of course, the King's great friend. She is a fascinating Tudor woman, and it is so sad that she died young. So that's today's event. I will, of course, be back tomorrow with another Tudor history event for you. Do feel free to browse all the other videos that I've got here, because, of course, I have, I started on the 1st of January, so there are so many Tudor events for you to enjoy deaths, births, marriages, baptisms, battles, coronations, horrible executions and burnings and not very nice things. But very, very interesting. Lots of Tudor talk for you to enjoy. You can subscribe to my channel by clicking round about there, which really does help. It helps other YouTube users to be able to find me. You could also give this video a like. And of course you can hit the bell to be notified so that you know when the videos go live, so you can watch them straight away. I do like it how people have a bit of a competition about being the very first one to comment on these videos. I really do appreciate your enthusiasm for my work and for Tudor history. I will see you tomorrow. Take care. Bye bye.